Before we get into the video, I want to point out that I'm no longer using Blender 2.8 and I'm now using the newest version. Blender 2.9 by and large has the same UI with a few minor changes that I'll address when they come up. I hope that doesn't confuse you guys. Up to now, we spent all of our time making our actual objects. Now we're actually going to talk about how to give them some character. But the question now becomes, how do we go about doing this? We set up the canvas for our models by UV mapping them, and now we have to choose our technique. And just like any art form, there are many techniques with their own benefits and drawbacks. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to break this portion of the series up into smaller, more digestible segments so I can address each technique individually, as well as why you should learn them and when you should use them for your objects. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most simple and effective way to texture our objects, Vertex Coloring. This method of texturing was used frequently throughout the PlayStation's game library, most notably in Crash Bandicoot. Crash himself and almost every enemy in the game utilizes Vertex Coloring in some way. This method of texturing is far more economical than image texturing. Instead of applying images along the surface of our model, we are instead assigning color values to the corners of our object's faces. These color values are then calculated and mixed along the edges of the mesh to form a gradient. And because of this, the colors that we're creating are also vector colors. Regardless of the size, our colors will retain the same level of detail. And one of the best things about Vertex Coloring is you don't even need to UV map your models for them to work. You can just jump straight in. Here's the model that I'm going to paint for this video. I wanted to use something a little bit different than normal, and I also wanted to show off how Vertex colors look on more complex objects. Now, the first order of business is to tell Blender that we want to use Vertex colors for our model. Just like we did for setting up image textures, we have to add Vertex colors to our material. But for as nice as the materials tab is, sometimes it gets a little bit too cramped. And the more complex that our materials get, the harder it is to use this tab. So we're going to introduce a new way to manage our materials. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our object here in object mode, and then we're going to go up here to the workspaces tab, and we're going to click on the tab that says shading. And when we do that, we get some new windows to look at. On the left, we have a file browser and a image viewer. I don't really use these so much, so I normally get rid of them. And on the right, we have the 3D viewport, and below that, we have the shader editor. This is what I was using last video when I was applying the brick texture and doing all that extra stuff that I didn't really go over. Well, I'm going to be touching on the shader editor now and how we're going to be using it. The shader editor is a visual node editor that allows us to see more precisely what our shaders are doing and how they're connected. If I click on this new material button, we can see that it adds two new sets of nodes, the principled BDSF and the material output. Now, normally in these videos, I delete the principled shader in favor of the diffuse shader because of how simple the diffuse shader actually is. Well, I'm not going to do that this time. This time around, we're going to actually use the principled shader so I can explain a little bit about how the node system works. So as you can see on the nodes, every node has a set of colored sockets, some on the left and some on the right. All the sockets on the left of the nodes are input, and all the sockets on the right are output. On top of this, there's also an established color code that tells us exactly what each socket does. Yellow sockets are for color data. They handle pictures, videos, and everything in between. Gray sockets handle value data, as in numbers. As you can see on the principled node, there are a lot of gray sockets. And you'll also notice that they only normally hold a value between 1 and 0, with a few exceptions, that is. Then there's the purple sockets, which are vector values. They hold Cartesian values, x, y, and z. Don't really worry about them much right now. And finally, we have the green sockets. These are shader sockets. They do shader things. Alright, let's add our vertex colors. Unlike the materials tab where you had to click a button to get the input option menu, in the shader editor, we can add nodes just as if we were adding objects in the 3D viewport. If we hit Shift A, we get the add menu, and for convenience, we can actually use a search bar on the top here to find exactly what we want. So let's type in Vertex Colors. We select it from the search menu, and then we click to place it on the editor. Now all we have to do is connect it. So to do that, we need to grab this yellow socket here on the right side of the node and drag it into the base color socket of the principled shader. And when we connect the node, we can now see in the viewport that our object has turned black, just like when we added an empty image texture. We currently don't have any actual vertex colors, so let's go about adding them now. To add vertex colors to our object, what we need to do is we need to go to the Object Data Property tab, or the green tab right here above the Materials tab. Now, there are several menus here, but the one that we want is the one that says Vertex Colors. And if we open it up, we get a list sort of like the Materials tab. We can add new Vertex Colors by hitting the plus button, and we can take them away by hitting the minus button. So I'm going to name this one Base Color, and I'm going to name this one Alpha. It's important to know that our Vertex Color node will load whichever Vertex Color is currently toggled as the active render, which is designated by this camera toggle button. If we had multiple different vertex colors for our object, we could swap between them by toggling this camera button. This feature makes painting multiple layers easier so you can swap between the layers as you work. But you should also know you can hardwire our vertex color nodes to load only one specific color layer. We can do this by going into the vertex color node itself and selecting the vertex color that we want to use. Alright, now that that's done, let's talk about vertex paint. I'm going to swap back to the layout workspace so that way I can have a better view of my object. And then I'm going to go up here to the object interaction menu, and then I'm going to select Vertex Paint. And with us finally here, let's talk about the tools at our disposal. On the left side, there are currently 4 tools that we can use for vertex painting. The paintbrush is pretty self-explanatory. It paints. The blur tool is also pretty self-explanatory. It blends the surrounding colors together. The average tool is a little bit funky. Basically what it does is it takes the colors underneath the cursor and averages them all out. It's basically just a blur tool, but with extra steps. And finally, we have the smear tool. It pushes our vertex colors around, just like you'd expect. Alright, now let's go over some shortcuts and tool features. To look at our brush settings, we can go over here to the Active Tool and Workspace tab, the one with the screwdriver and wrench. And in here, we get every setting that we could need. Color, brush size, brush strength, color palettes. It's got a lot of things for us to play with. But it's a little inconvenient to adjust the settings from the menu every time. It slows your work down. So here are a few set of hotkeys you can use to speed up your work in Vertex Paint. To select a color, you can hit the W button, and this will bring up a color wheel. You can also change the size and strength of the brush here, as well as the blend mode, which I'm not going to discuss yet. You should also know that your brush can hold 2 colors at once, and you can swap between them by pressing the X button. If you want to adjust the size of your brush on the fly, if you press F, you'll bring up a radial display of the current size of your brush that you can adjust by moving it in and out. Likewise, if you hit Shift F, you can also adjust the strength of the brush. And finally, if you want to sample colors from the surroundings, you can hit S, and this will allow you to sample colors from anything in the scene. Alright, with our basic hotkeys established, I just want to do 2 more housekeeping things before we start. I'm going to go back to our Vertex Color menu and make sure that I have base color selected. When we vertex paint, it only paints on the current active selected vertex color group. And since we have 2, we want to make sure that we're actually painting on the correct one. And finally, I want to be able to see the vertices when I paint. I'm going to go up here to the Overlays menu, the one that kind of looks like a Venn diagram. I'm going to open it up and I'm going to toggle Wireframe. And with that done, let's get painting. I want to paint this castle in some pastel colors, something nice and bright. I'm going to go over here and open up the color palette menu, and I'm going to make a new palette. I'm thinking for this castle, I want it to be a nice sky blue with some pink roofing and a light brown for the gate here. Maybe I'll take a slightly darker blue and a nice cream color too. So I'm going to add them to my brush and then add them to the color palette by hitting the plus sign. Then I'm going to rip open a pocket dimension by hitting the slash key on my keyboard so I can paint my castle in the darkness where I dwell. The slash key, if you don't know, basically acts as a sort of temporary view layer where you can work in. It's useful if you want to work on a few items while hiding everything else. Now, I'm going to start off by painting the entire castle blue. So I'm going to go over here and select... Oh right, there's no fill tool. Well, that's annoying. Blender does have a fill tool, but it is hidden. If you go up here to this paint menu and open it up, it's right there. It's Set Vertex Color, Shift K. Why did they do that? No idea. So with our first coat of paint, I'm going to start adding some detail. I'm going to paint the tips of the castle cream. Then I'm going to follow it up with a darker purple color, and then underneath the tower caps, I'm going to use this pink color. Unfortunately, there's not a way for us to copy our work over from one tower to the other. However, there is a way to do all 5 tower caps at once. So let's undo real quickly. We're now going to begin using masks to help us paint faster. We got 2 different masking methods that are at our disposal, and they're both right up here next to the object interaction menu. The first option is face masking, which will allow us to make sharp, flat-colored faces like this, and vertex masking, which will allow for softer vertex colors. These masks are based off selection. We can select the areas that we want to paint by either selecting them in vertex paint mode or by selecting them in edit mode. So with that in mind, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna use the Vertex mask, and we're gonna start by selecting the very tip of every tower cap and set it to the cream color. Then I'm going to ring select the bottom edges of the tower cap, and we'll assign the dark purple color. And finally, just underneath that, we're gonna ring select underneath the lip of the towers, and we'll assign the pink color. Alright, now that I'm thinking about it, since the top of our model is really bright, we should assign some darker colors to the bottom. So I'm gonna ring select the bottom of the castle, and I'm gonna assign the darker blue color here. Then finally, to color the gate, I'm gonna use the face select mask here, and while still in vertex mode, I'm gonna hit L to select the entire gate, and then assign it the color that I need it to be. And with that, we have finished the base colors of our vertex paint. But you know what? I think we can go a little bit further with this. What if we decided to add some fake lighting? We could just as easily paint some shadows and highlights on our castle, but there's one big problem with that approach, and it's that it's a destructive workflow. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what that term means, basically it means that we are directly changing our object's color, and in essence, destroying the original colors to replace them with something new. So what we need is a non-destructive workflow, a way to add onto our objects the shadows and lighting without actually destroying our base colors. In a lot of image editing software like GIMP or Photoshop, you actually have the ability to work in layers. You can have your line work, your colors, highlights, and shadows all on separate layers so they can come together to make the final image. And that's what we're going to set up in Blender to make our lives easier. And here's how we're going to go about doing it. What we're going to do is we're going to take our object and we're going to duplicate it twice. So that way we have 3 different castles. The castle on the left will hold the shadow information, and the castle on the right will hold the lighting information. We're also going to delete the alpha vertex color from the both of them, since they're not going to be using it. For the moment, we're just going to paint these castles gray so they're completely neutral. Now to go about making the color layering system. What we're going to do is go back to our original castle, and we're going to apply a modifier called the data transfer modifier. Basically what this modifier is going to do is it's going to pull information from our duplicate castles and combine them with this one. I'll do the shadow data first. For the source, we're obviously going to use the eyedropper to select the shadow layer. Then to pull the vertex color data, we need to toggle face corner data to tell what kind of data we're trying to pull. Then we're going to open that menu up and toggle the vertex color button. Then we'll have to change the mapping method from what it's currently set to topology. And finally, we need to tell Blender what vertex colors are going to be mixed with what. So right below the mapping menu, we can open up this drop-down menu for vertex colors, and here we're going to select which colors we're using. Layer selection is the vertex colors Blender will use from our source object, and layer mapping will determine what color is going to be affected in our original object. And in both instances, we're going to select base color. And finally, we're going to change the way that our color is being mixed. It's currently set to replace, and well, obviously that's not going to work, so what we're going to do is we're going to set the mix mode from replace to multiply. Now we're not going to get into the weeds of what every mix mode does, but basically what it is that multiply is a method that is going to be used to darken our colors, and this will allow us to replicate shadows. And as you can see, we have it properly set up now, so we can even adjust the strength of the effect with the mix factor value. All we gotta do now is rename the modifier, and we'll do the exact same thing for the light data. However, this time instead of using multiply, we're gonna be using add. The add mixing mode is used for adding and making colors brighter, which is, funnily enough, exactly what light does. So this is perfect for our purposes. Now our base model shouldn't have any shadows or lighting on it as of right now, so we're gonna have to reset our layer colors on our objects to make sure that they're actually accurate. So for our shadow object, we're gonna have to paint it entirely white so there's no shadows at all, and then our light object, we're gonna have to paint it entirely dark so there's no lighting. I think I'm gonna start with the shadows this time. The first thing I want to add shadows to is the gate. It's currently raised up in the castle, and I feel that should have some shadows on them. We're going to go into Vertex Paint mode and link select our gate and hide everything else. Then in Edit mode, we're going to make a box selection to select everything that we want to have shadows on them. Then we're going to go back to Vertex Paint mode so we can paint what we just selected black. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take the blur tool and then smooth it out to make it look nice and clean. Now for the rest of the shadows. What we're going to do is we're going to assign darker colors under all the portions of the model where it lips outward. So this would be underneath all the ramparts as well as the tower caps and inside the gate itself. So we'll just go about masking these areas in edit mode and painting them out. This can be a bit of a time-consuming process, so I'm not going to describe every action that I'm taking. Just know that I'm touching up all the areas that should be darkened. And just like that, we can see how the shadows are appearing on the original castle walls. Now to do the same thing for the light layer. We're going to paint on some areas that I think we should have some extra brightness on, namely the top of the towers and along the ramparts. And with that, I feel we finished off our colors here. If we wanted to, we can apply the modifier now and merge all of our layers together. Now normally I don't do this because it's better to keep them separated so you can edit them better, but for the next part I'm gonna need to merge them together. So to do that, we're gonna go into our modifiers tab and we're gonna click on this drop down menu here. In 2.8, the apply button used to be on the actual tab itself, but now it's inside a drop down menu. Or alternatively, you can hit Ctrl A to apply the modifier as well. Now that our castle is done, it's time for that secret tool. Remember that Vertex color group called Alpha that I haven't touched since we made it? Well, here's when we're actually going to start to use it. If you're familiar with what an alpha channel is, it's the level of transparency an object has, and you'll notice that our own Vertex colors actually have an alpha channel built into them. Now, I have an idea for a neat effect, and I want to use the alpha channel, but since we're using the Eevee renderer, we're first going to have to tell Blender that we want to use alpha. So to do this, we're going to go into our material settings, and down here where it says alpha blending mode. It's currently set to opaque, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna set it to alpha blend. Be sure to untoggle show backfaced first. With alpha turned on, we just gotta plug in the vertex color alpha into the shader alpha, and then we need to set up our brush. Right up here in our brush blend menu, we need to open it up and change it from mix to erase alpha. And now as we paint on our model, we can see that our object now does in fact have some transparency to it. For the effect that I'm wanting, I'm thinking that I want to have an alpha gradient that's mostly transparent at the bottom and opaque near the top, sort of turn it into a more spectral holographic castle. However, trying to paint with alpha in this mode is more than just a nightmare in Vertex Paint. For one, the fill option doesn't assign alpha, it only assigns colors, so we can't use the same technique that we've been using throughout this tutorial. Secondly, it's not going to be possible to get a clean effect considering that you can't blur an alpha channel without affecting the base color on the top. So with that in mind, we're really in a bit of a rough place. But I want to show you something, and it's going to be the foundation of how we're going to solve this problem. Let's take the alpha channel of our vertex colors and plug them into the base color. So what we just did is we took a numerical value socket and plugged it directly into a color value socket. We're actually able to see a white and black map that was created when we actually painted the alpha channel. But I'm not done. What if we took the color socket of our vertex colors and plugged it directly into the alpha of our shader? As you can see, there is something in our vertex colors that are being translated into an alpha value. So what exactly is happening here? As I've mentioned earlier in this video, value sockets represent a number between 1 and 0, and if you haven't realized it by now, to represent a value between 1 and 0, Blender uses the value of a color, how light or dark they are. Of course, the value sockets aren't supposed to handle the hue and saturation, so we're only going to use white and black. We're going to use this information to make our own alpha channel by using our alpha vertex color layer to circumnavigate our issues that we were having with the native alpha channel of the original. But we still have one problem. How are we going to make a gradient for the whole castle? It was easy enough to do it for the gate, but it's going to be a different story for how big this castle is. So, what if I told you that the solution was another workaround? Here's how we're going to go about doing it. So with our object selected, we're going to go up here to the object interaction menu and open it. And right below where it says Vertex Paint, we have something called Weight Paint mode. And when we select it, a few things are going to change. The first thing to note is that our object is going to turn blue, and our top bar is going to change around a little bit as well. We do, however, still have the same tools as well as the face and vertex masks. However, instead of being able to paint directly in color, we're sort of painting with this heat map. The thing is with this weight paint mode is that this heat map is actually representing a numerical value between 1 and 0, red hot representing 1 and ice blue representing 0. So what is weight paint used for and why are we here? Well, weight paint mode can be used for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which includes rigging and particle systems and physics simulations. Yeah, we're not going to dwell on it, but the real reason why we're here is because it has a gradient tool. Awesome. So we're going to take this gradient tool and we're going to get painting. I'm just going to click down from the center of the castle and drag it down, and with that, our gradient's painted. Now to convert it into Vertex Paint. If we go back to Vertex Paint, well, we still see our base color. Let's quickly swap out the base color for the alpha channel that we need. All we gotta do is go up here to this paint menu, open it up, and on the fourth option we can see Vertex Color from Weight. And once we select that, it will convert our weight gradient that we just painted into a grayscale vertex paint, which is perfect for us to use. All we gotta do now is to plug it into the shader alpha, and why not we throw it into the metallic channel, why not? And boom, a very nice, cartoony, spectral castle. Okay, so we went over some techniques on how to use Vertex Paint, how it works, as well as how to do some interesting effects with it. But when should you use Vertex Paints in your model? Well, a lot of it comes down to the aesthetics of what you're trying to go for. If you're wanting something gritty or realistic like Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Parasite Eve, or Vagrant Story, Vertex Colors aren't really on display. Those games are more texture heavy. However, each game sort of pays a price to achieve the sort of realism that they have, either by having pre-rendered environments with fixed camera angles, or by requiring very short render distances. The only game that didn't really have this drawback was Vagrant Story, and that game pushed the PS1 to its absolute limits. For more cartoony games like Spyro, Crash Bandicoot, or Medieval, Vertex Colors can add a very lighthearted and colorful vibe to them that would be muddied if textures were used instead. In terms of our project, I don't really think I'm going to use Vertex Colors. I think I might use them on the plate and bowl, but I'm not going to use Vertex Colors by themselves. With some assistance from texturing, Vertex Colors can create absolutely amazing scenery and characters. Take a look at this game for a perfect example of Vertex painting. Zera, Myth Awakens by Cerades. This game is a true love letter to the PlayStation, the Spyro series, and is an absolute gorgeous game to look at. And just like the Spyro series, most things, the terrain, the characters, and especially the skyboxes, all use Vertex Colors. But the question is, how did Cerades get this look? He's using both textures and Vertex Colors on the same object in some cases. Well, that's what we're going to cover in the next video, Vertex Colors Part 2. We're going to be covering how to texture our models for a good while to come, so I hope you're excited. I haven't even scraped the surface of what is possible with Blender and texturing. Thank you everyone for watching this video. If this game that's on screen interests you in any way, there's a link in the description to the Game Jolt page. It's still in alpha and a long way from being done, but I still suggest you to download it. The game is currently free, but I highly suggest that you do give them a little something. After all, making games is probably one of the hardest and time-consuming things people spend their time on, so I think they deserve it. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe as more will be coming. Be sure to join the PlayStation 1 subreddit for more content, or join my Discord if you're interested in that. We're all hanging out, grooving, having some good times. And with that, see you all next time.